about what was the impact of the Peasants Revolt. So last lesson we looked at the causation of the Peasants Revolt. We're now going to look at the consequences of it. The key word today is rustic. It's an insulting word you'd use for a peasant. People still use rustic today as quite an insulting term, but it's mainly aimed at peasants. Here is our recap quiz based on last lesson's knowledge. So we've got 4 questions here. The first question is, who was John Bull? What was his job? What did he do? Question number 2, this is linking the last 2 or 3 lessons together. How did the Black Death lead to the Peasants' Revolt? Number 3, what event triggered the Peasants' Revolt in Essex in 1381? And our last question, number 4, is how did the rich try to control the peasants in 1351? Pause this here, because if you haven't completed every question, you can go back now, reread them and answer the questions. Hopefully you finished every single question now, because here are the answers. If you got the answers correct, give yourself a tick. If you got them wrong, cross it out and then write the correct answer next to it. Our timeline on medieval monarchs that we've been looking at the past few lessons. Same as last lesson, we are still in 1381 at the Peasants' Revolt, because we looked at before the causes, so we were looking this way back, what caused the Peasants' Revolt, but now we're going to be looking at the consequences, so we're going to be looking more forward. How did the Peasants' Revolt affect history? So here's the worksheet, Year 7, if you're working on it. For a bunch of questions and video we're going to watch, you can do the questions here, 5 bullet points, and then the video is hyperlinked here, so you can click on that. Video is from BBC Bitesize, so hopefully everyone should be able to access this video, be you at home or school. If you're working on the PowerPoint, the link to the video is hyperlinked into the background. So if you click on this gentleman's face here, you'll be taken to video. So I'm going to tell you the 5 questions now before you watch the video. So then as you're watching it, you can answer them. So the first question is, what did the rebels demand from King Richard I? Question number 2, what violent act did the rebels carry out at the Tower of London? Do you remember who built the Tower of London? Hopefully you've all remembered it was William the Conqueror. It was built in, I believe it was about 1087. It still stands to this day. Very important building. Question number 3. What did Wat Tyler demand from Richard I? I've just noticed that this PowerPoint says what, like I would say what. Wat wouldn't spell his name like that. It would spell it like this, W-A-T. That's a good segue into question 4. What happened to Wat Tyler? What happened to him? Did he grow old, have lots of grandchildren, live happily ever after? Maybe? Probably not. I want you to find out what actually happened to him. And lastly, the last question, number 5. How did Richard I respond to the revolt once he had led the peasants to believe they would be successful? Did he throw a banquet? Did he all have a great time? Or did Richard do something else? Well, what I want you to do now, Year 7, is pause me here. I want you to go and watch that video. You can either find it hyperlinked onto in the PowerPoint on the background, or if you're working on a worksheet, it is here. So pause me now and go and watch that video and then answer our 5 questions. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So while today's lesson is quite based on consequences, we're going to be doing a lot of source work. And by a lot of source work, I mean this is going to be the main chunk of the lesson. So you're going to read the information slides, the information on slide 9. I'm going to send it as an attachment with the lesson, the PowerPoint and the YouTube video, so you can have it separate if you want to. You could print it off, you could just keep it up on a computer. You're going to read through the sources, then you're going to find evidence within them to answer the following questions. I'll show you the questions on the next slide. You're going to find the evidence from the source. That is where you highlight it on your source. You're then going to quote directly from the source into the table, which I'll show you, and then you can provide justification to support your answer. I've completed one example for you, or 2 examples for you, so you can see what I expect you to do. Because of how the questions are worded, Year 7, not all the sources can fit into every box, so don't try and complete the whole table. I'll show you what I mean by that later on. Here are our 5 sources: source A, source B, source C, source D, and also, finally, source E. I'm going to read each source with you, one at a time, so it'll be like source A, then we're going to look at the table, then source B, and then we'll look at the table, and we'll do that until we finish at source E. This will help you understand and fill out your table much better. Here is our table. It is going to be on the worksheet, so if you're working on the worksheet, you don't need to worry. If you're not completing on the worksheet, you can draw this table like this. So it's going to be 6 columns across, and then 3 rows down. I'll read the questions now, each one of these boxes, so that you can understand the kind of questions you have to answer. So the first one, which is this one right here, the Peasants Revolt was a complete failure. If you can find evidence in source A to support that, you'll place it here. Number 2, the Peasants Revolt showed the nobles that they could not push the poor too far anymore, because the Peasants Revolt shows that peasants will stand up for themselves now. And if you can find evidence to support this idea, you'll place it in these boxes. And finally, the last one, the Peasants Revolt led eventually to greater wealth and freedom for the peasants. So if you can find evidence to support that statement, that question, you'll place it in these boxes. If you're on the worksheet, as I stated earlier, the table is here. Because it's formatted weirdly, the table is split between 2 different pages, but it works out quite well. So source A, this is from an account written by Thomas Walsingham around 1420. He's describing what the King Richard I, supposedly said to the rebels. Rustics you were, and rustics you are still. You will remain in bondage, not as before, but harsher. For as long as we live, we will strive with mind, strength, and goods to suppress you as an example to future generations. So as we can see here, Richard, our king, he's using this term, rustics. That was one of my keywords from earlier. Quite a bad word to say to a peasant, quite a derogatory term. So looking at this, we've got to think about our 3 statements. Either Peasants Revolt was a complete failure, the Peasants Revolt showed the nobles that they could not push the poor too far. I think source A definitely won't be in that, because Richard is saying to the peasants that he will push them further now. Number 3, the Peasants Revolt eventually led to much greater wealth and freedom for the peasants. Was it number 1, number 2, or number 3? I think, I'm looking at this information here that I'm highlighting now, it's going to go on the first one. The Peasants Revolt was a complete failure. So you will remain in bondage, and not as before, but harsher. So as we can see, this is going to go here, isn't it? You can clearly see that that's showing that the Peasants Revolt is a complete failure, because Richard is planning to be much meaner to peasants than before. I haven't done the justification on the end fully, but you can do that aspect. So, source B, from a textbook, Monarchs, Monks and Migrants, 2017. The king's forces toured the area that had rebelled and put to death any rebels that they found. In Hertfordshire and Essex, 500 people were executed, while in Kent, up to 1,500 people were hanged. That's about 2 loads of Barnsley Academy students lined up and hung. The worst punishment was reserved for those who led the revolt. John Ball, a radical preacher who had questioned the whole feudal system, he was captured. On the 15th of July, in front of a crowd in the marketplace of St. Albans, he was hanged, drawn and quartered. That basically means he was hung, was chopped down, he had his guts pulled out, and then he was chopped into little bits. He was hanged, he was drawn, and he was quartered. Gruesome. Wat Tyler's head was cut from his body, mounted on a pole, and paraded through the streets of London before being put on a spike on London Bridge. That does not sound particularly nice. A clear warning was being sent out to those who had resisted the king and dared question their place in society, who had dared challenge the feudal system like John Ball had. By the end of 1381, the revolt had been utterly crushed. The charters that the king had granted to the rebels were cancelled. I've highlighted there some examples for you, Year 7. Good evidence. Which one of these do you think source B falls into? Is it Peasants Revolt was a complete failure? It showed the nobles that they could not push the poor too far anymore, or that it led to greater wealth and freedom for the peasants? I think, I'll give you a hint, I think it might be up here. I can't think of anything positive out of source B. Source C, from textbook Medieval Britain, 410 to 1509 by Robert Peel, 2016. The Peasants Revolt may have been a failure, so that is very similar to the last two, but feudal England had been challenged. Over the next 2 centuries, England's peasants gradually became freemen. Freemen is what it sounds like, you're a free man, and were no longer tied to working for their feudal lords. You can find lots of much more positive examples there within that work. So if we go now to the next slide, to the table, I think we can very clearly see, as well, the author of the source does say it was a complete failure, he also says there's some positives. So it's definitely not that one. I'm going to leave it up to you now if you think it's going to go in this box or that box, why you think that. Source D, from the History of England, Volume 1 by Peter Arkwright, published in 2011. The living standards of agricultural workers, these are farmers, improved recognizably over a generation. Real wages grew, despite the attempts to stop this with new laws, such as the statute of labourers. Life expectancy, this also rose. The historians of dress noted that clothing became brighter and more luxurious and jewellery more evident. We can see there that that's quite positive, isn't it? That's very positive. What's even better, you can get a historian of clothes. So, this now source D. What do we think? Well, I'm going to give you a bit of a hand. There we go. So I've said the living standards of agricultural workers, farmers, improved recognisably over a generation. Now I'm going into a bit further depth in what I mean there. As we can see from source D, the living standards of the peasants improved. However, these improvements were not felt straight away, because in the source it says over a generation. For sources A, B, and C, Year 7, if you've not done a justification like this one, for source D, I want you to pause this video right now, go back to your previous entries on this table, and add a justification to it, okay? We're now going to move on to source E. So source E is again from that same book as source D, from the History of England, Volume 1, by Peter Arkwright, published in 2011. The consequence of the revolt was unease and even dread. Unease and dread are positive emotions. Dread is when you're scared something's going to happen. For more than 2 centuries, fear most experienced by the authorities was that of local rebellion. We can see here the fear. I imagine a lot of you thought fear would have been felt by the peasants, but it wasn't felt by the peasants at all. Fear was held by the lords. They were the ones who were scared. In the face of unbearable tensions between nobles and peasants, attempts were made to appease the demands of the peasants. No further poll tax was ever extracted until 1989. So we can see here that the actions of the nobles are being significantly changed and modified because of the peasants. Not just because of the peasants, but because they're scared of what the peasants may do. And you think the poll tax is never introduced again until 1989. This was by a very famous and controversial Prime Minister called Margaret Thatcher. If you want to do something fun, you could go ask your parents about who Margaret Thatcher is. They have very strong opinions about her up in the north. I'm going to let you do this section by yourself, Year 7. Hopefully, it should be quite simple. So what was the impact of the Peasants Revolt? As we can see from those 5 sources, they could be people have very different opinions on it. But also, how should we remember the revolt? Historians have disagreed over time on its impact. So we're going to call this one, Year 7, number 1. The rebels were a disorganized rabble from different countries and counties who had no clear plan and failed because of it. However, they have become important in later times as the first group of working class people fighting against the rich for their rights. So that's one interpretation of it from number 1. So number 1 is saying that while it failed massively, it's really important for people much more closer to today to look back and see this first example of working class people fighting against the rich. Number 2, this one here. The revolt didn't matter at all because the feudal system was slowly falling apart anyway as a result of the Black Death, which had led to rising cost of labour. So number 2 saying Peasants Revolt isn't important at all, because what's really important, what really changed things, was the Black Death. And I imagine this person's arguing that the feudal system probably would have ended anyway, with or without the Peasants Revolt. Now we're going to move on to this last one, number 3. The rebels were disciplined and organised. They were not only peasants, but these were the leaders of village life, speaking out against real and important grievance against the rich who were using laws like the Statute of Labourers to oppress the poor. So this one, number 3, is a very different take than number 1. So what I want you to do now is be on this worksheet here, just there. What I want you to do is I want you to summarise each one of those historians' viewpoints into 10 words. So you'll do the first one in 10 words, the second one in 10 words, and the third and last one in 10 words. Once you've done that, what I want you to do is close your book because you've finished. Made this lesson a bit shorter because last lesson was quite long. So once you've completed this work, please do email it to me. I can't wait to read it. I can't wait to see how different people look at the Black Death and the Peasants Revolt.